It's good to be here with you this evening. Joe mentioned change. It's good to be back in this building. I did my student teaching here, and with Wallace Brown back the hall back there somewhere, and it's just kind of good to get back in the old building, and also to see that change has come and it has a repurposed use. Let me give you two disclaimers before I start talking about local Mennonite history. One is I'm kind of a chatty style, and so don't try to get footnotes on everything to prove everything. If you want to do that, you can. The second thing is that I am an imported Yankee, which says the whole thing. We came and we stayed, and like some more of you, and so I've made I came from Lancaster and know Lancaster story, and when I came to Virginia, I picked up on the Virginia story, although I lived over in more eastern Virginia, so I had more the eastern Virginia, the Newport News, Denby story, more than the Valley story until I moved here, and then I had to pick that story up. And so I'm not, I'm one of the, you might say, the new Virginians rather than the old Virginians. And the lady who used to be in at the historical library, she commented about that. The old Virginians are different than the new Virginians. And they had a different way of thinking and a different way of doing things. And then all these new Virginians came in, new people came in, and anyhow, she let it be known that there was a difference between old Virginians and new Virginians. So someone like David Burkholder, who's an old Virginian, and his family, and some of the others of you, you might see the story a little bit different than I may. But the Virginia story is a mixed story, and I'm not here to whitewash the sepulchres of the forefathers tonight, because if we did that, we would not be honest with history. There are things from our forefathers that we can build on and we can use to answer the questions that children bring. When the children of Israel crossed over the Red Sea, not the Red Sea, well, yeah, they crossed there, but when they crossed the Jordan River, they gathered stones out and made a pile of stones at Gilgal, and then Joshua 4 says, when your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you are to tell them, they represent the faithfulness of God. And when we look at our history stories, they should point us to the faithfulness of God and also give us warnings of how we are to live, how we are to make decisions. I'll use probably basically 4 M words: migration, missions, military challenges, and facing new movements. And that will only take us to about 1900, but the story is too long to, and I do know that when people come to a history meeting, they probably have some interest unless they're children whose parents brought them. But usually when people make a decision to come to this kind of meeting, unless they feel guilty for not coming to church, they want to hear about history. So blessings to you for coming. But those 4 words. Mennonites kind of meandered into Virginia from Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. How did they get here? The big farmers and the plantations were east of the Blue Ridge. The Native Americans were west of the Blue Ridge. The Shenandoah Valley was kind of the buffer zone. And so the state church people across the mountains said, yeah, we'll let you Germans and Scotch-Irish come in here because we need a buffer. And that's why they got here. They moved into Page County. They moved into Shenandoah County. They moved into Frederick County. And basically, that first migration all died out. About the only remembrance basically people have is that little log church over toward Luray, Hamburg, which people go over and sit in the first Sunday in August and swelter Why they don't move it till the 1st of October or something when the weather's decent, I don't know, but that's a rabbit trail. But anyhow, that little meeting house is a reminder of the community that was there. When the Quakers came to Pennsylvania, George Fox said, "As you build your plantations, do not neglect the plantation of your soul." Do not neglect the plantations of your soul. In other words, as you're building your homes, you're building your farms, you're building your factories, don't forget your soul. And so when they came from Pennsylvania and moved into Page County, the little community where they live is called Egypt Bend, and it was because it was a very plentiful, prosperous area along the Shenandoah River when you go across the mountain from Newmarket to Luray. They built large houses. Some of them were so large that people called them forts, but they weren't forts. They were just big German houses. And they settled there. And someone asked me recently, what was the relationship between these people and the Native Americans? I think the Native Americans were pretty well gone by then. Nobody left any records, but we don't know. But in the 1750s, the 1760s, when the French and Indian War began, there was trouble because there was Indian raids came across the mountains into the Page Valley. They wrote a letter to the Dutch Mennonites asking for help because when the Native American warriors came, there were about 40 families of Mennonites living there. One family was killed, and the rest fled back to Pennsylvania. There were many other people there, too, that maybe 50 people were killed in that area by the Native Americans. Peace was restored, and people moved back. And then in 1764, there was a Mennonite preacher and his family were massacred. The last of those persons massacred, preacher John Rhodes and his wife and a number of his children were killed. He had a large family, so about half of them survived living other places. He had one daughter who escaped the massacre with her little child, her sister in her arms, and fled. And so the family name continued. But the Rhodes massacre was the last of the killings by Native Americans in that area. Now, what mean these stones? If you cross over the Shenandoah River toward Luray, on the left there's a little cemetery with a monument that tells his story. And also on the farm where John Rhodes was killed, there is a monument too, but I think it's private property now. So good luck if you can get in. And that was basically the end of the negative interactions with Native Americans in that community. The community, people came back from Pennsylvania, but then the community eventually died out. Why? Many groups have seen Mennonites as a mission field. Mennonites were quiet, not very demonstrative in their religion. And so when more lively groups came in, they always looked at the Mennonites and said, "You're a dead bunch. We need to do something to revive you," and basically that is convert you to our religion. And that's what happened there in that area. The Moravians came in. The Moravians were kinder than the Baptists because the Moravians were a little friendlier. And these people in this era, some people were new lights and some people were old lights. And it happened in all the denominations, old light Baptists, Presbyterians, all that, and new lights. And the new lights are the ones who wanted to get on fire for the Lord and be more expressive in their religion. It happened to the Mennonites in Pennsylvania, and one of the new light Mennonites came down and ministered among them and did help them to find spiritual renewal. But I think what happened was there was a lot of emphasis on getting the plantations of their farms going, and they neglected the plantations of their souls. So they were a mission field, and the local Baptists said they were dead and said, we've got to convert these people. And there was a young leader who went with the Baptists, and but he had a troubled conscience. He said, the Revolutionary War came, and he wasn't a good Baptist, because the Baptists called him Mennonite Baptists. They weren't sure quite what to do with them. And they said, these Mennonite Baptists said, the Revolutionary War is here, and Jesus had some specific things to say about war. And the Baptists said, well, that's a non-essential. And the Mennonite Baptists said, well, what about slavery? We think slavery might be not a good thing, and that's a non-essential. Well, what about swearing of oaths? The Bible says no, not swearing of oaths. Oh, that's a non-essential. And so they kept telling them that the things that they wanted to, that were holding on to from their earlier Christian faith, were non-essentials. And so they kind of isolated themselves, these Mennonite Baptists, and they were isolated from the old Mennonite community because they were no longer with them. And so they built their own place of meeting and kind of worshiped separate from the Baptists even, and had a little Mennonite Baptist group there. As you cross the river, the Shenandoah River, going from Newmarket to Luray, look down on the right, and there's this white stone 2-story building. That was the Mennonite meeting house. Now, it was 1 story back in those days. Somebody added a 2nd story, but that's where the Mennonite Baptists worshipped. And more, maybe 70 people joined that group. It was led by a charismatic leader, in that the group revolved around one leader. And when he passed off the scene, the group kind of fizzled out. But the old Mennonite church kind of fizzled out too. And so the church there in that area died. The church died in Strasbourg. The church died in around Winchester. For about, well, one of them was because they converted to other churches. Many of them were scattered out, and so their young people had no one to marry except their neighbors, and so they did. They did not have strong leaders, and also there was land trouble. Different of the people had gotten land from the King of England, and he was handing out land, and some of them had paid for their land, and then someone else came along and said, hey, this is my land, and they said, we don't want to pay for our farms twice, so they packed up and left. But that community basically died. And I won't say that it wasn't that they were, on fire for the Lord and good spiritual people, but they were a people who did not have strong enough leaders to point them to Jesus and to follow Jesus in the way of their forefathers. And the Baptists weren't sure what to do with them, because they had even appealed to the government to say, could we have exemption from military service? And the Baptists said, well, this is not the way we do things. But a reminder that unless faith is transmitted in a living and vital way, it will die out. And that's what happened in Page County and up and down the valley. And that when the people came back from Pennsylvania as refugees, or new people came, they started moving to Rockingham County. They first moved north of Harrisonburg. That's where you had the Brunks, and you had the Showalters, and you had the Shanks, and the Giles living there in northern Rockingham County. The Trissels Church is just celebrating their 200th anniversary of building their meeting house. But the movement was basically south into Harrisonburg. They built the Pike Meeting House, early 1800s. They built the Weavers Meeting House. There were a number of sessions of conference began about 1835, were held there. And the church was developing in this part of the Shenandoah Valley. 3 districts, the upper district, the lower district, and the middle district. And you have to be a Virginian to understand this. But the lower district was in the north and the upper district was in the south. And fortunately, the middle district is around here, so that's not quite as complicated. It wasn't until 1945 that they changed the names of the district as Northern District, which was the lower district, and that kind of thing. But it was you have to be an old Virginian to kind of understand that. Okay. It's because of the way the rivers run. At first, they worshiped in homes and were very separated from outsiders. But one of the very first things, the third verse of the song we sang, about sharing your faith with the neighbors. The Virginia Mennonites were unique, perhaps, in that they were very active in sharing their faith with their neighbors. L.J. Heatwell, a leader years later, wrote kind of the history of this area and of how the mission work was carried out. A very interesting way they carried out the mission work was funerals. The people would come and ask the ministers, would you conduct funerals? And the Mennonites didn't charge for it. And maybe that was the reason they kept coming and asking them. But they used the going into homes in times of grief and bereavement to minister to them and then share with them, sharing faith. And it began to open doors. Peter Burkholder, the big house on Garbers Church Road that's now the bed and breakfast up there, would go into Harrisonburg and conduct funerals. And then in following through those contacts were applications for baptism in the early 1800s. People were coming to faith in Christ. And then as they moved to a new mission field. And guess where that was? Along Muddy Creek and Dry River and west of Mole Hill. And that was a new territory. I understand that the ground wasn't that great back in those days, but that comes later. But this area through here was kind of the Mennonite frontier. And the people, they came, and the ministers began, again, meeting in homes, people moving here. And then they asked that they would build a meeting house along Dry River, along the river bank, which became the Bank Church. And that congregation began to grow in numbers and became the largest congregation. But the interesting thing about that early congregation, it had more people whose ancestry was from outside of the Mennonite church than any other congregation in Virginia. This is according to L.J. Heatwell's article that he wrote for the Youth Christian Companion in 1924. But these people were sharing their faith with their neighbors, and if you read the old records, all kinds of names that were not traditional names in the Mennonite community began showing up in the church. And then they began moving into the Mount Clinton area, using schoolhouses, and somewhere, and I haven't been able to figure out where it is, the church began to grow in this community until people began to join the church, and eventually a meeting house was built. It says west of Mount Clinton, so I'm assuming it's fairly close to where the cemetery is up here in the hill. And church was held on Sunday afternoons, and Mennonite families would come, and their neighbors would come, and the preachers would come, and they would share the gospel, and so the church was established in this community. We don't often think of the missionary impulse as important among our forefathers here in Virginia, but it was. Then they moved, they kind of skipped the foothills where Peak and Bethany and some of those, Gospel Hill, some of those churches are. They kind of skipped that and went over the mountains into West Virginia, and scattered believers were gathered around Brandywine, Shady Grove, some of those kind of places. And the ministers would go across, primarily ministers going across the mountains and preaching and gathering families. And it was very much a bed and breakfast thing in those days, because the ministers would stay in homes, they would give them beds, they would give them breakfast, they would preach in their homes, they would preach in their schoolhouses, and make a long weekend or that. And this was all prior to the Civil War. You had ministers making the trip over the mountains. Then things kind of shut down because of the Civil War as far as the missionary impulse. With the coming of the Civil War was a defining time for the Virginia Mennonites, because they were here in the Confederacy, and all the other Mennonite communities, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Pennsylvania, were all in Union territory. And they felt a oneness in the brotherhood. Many of the denominations divided: Baptist, Southern Baptist, Northern Baptist, Southern Methodist, Northern Methodist. But the Mennonites and the Brethren people did not divide and continued as a community together. How many Mennonites were here during the Civil War? Maybe 350, 400 families. Most of them were against secession, against slavery, and against war. And I say mostly because I'll mention the dissenters a little bit later. One of the issues that the church faced during this time was their bishop, Martin Kaufman, had just died, 1860, and the new bishop, Samuel Kaufman, was the new leader, and he was young, he was inexperienced, he was a good leader, but he was inexperienced. And also with the coming of the Civil War, it kind of bang, it hit them, and they had no time to have some kind of a brotherhood meeting or bring everybody together and discuss, now, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Samuel Kaufman was preaching at Weaver's Church, June 1861. They heard horses' hooves outside in the yard. Two Confederate men in uniform came walking in, came down the center aisle, and sat on the front bench. Many of you know these stories, but I discover as children come on, they don't know the stories, and make sure your children know the stories. Now, don't picture the present Weaver's Church. The Weaver Church at that time was on the other side of the road. But they came walking in and sat down. I think it would have been rather unnerving for Bishop Kaufman as he preached, but he called for the closing song, and when he closed for the closing song, one of the Confederate leaders stood up and said, "All men 18 to 45 are to immediately report for military duty." And left. And so now they had to make their decision. What are they going to do? Understand the final song was never sung that morning. The congregation just kind of fell apart as far as emotions and so forth. How are they going to face it? They could accept forced military service against their conscience. They could be court-martialed, possibly killed for being a deserter. They could go into hiding. And the majority of them obeyed the government order and went to the military camps, stopping by Bishop Kaufman's house and saying, "We will not shoot." And Frank, I guess you can tell the story of Christian Good. Yeah.
Rob probably knows it better than I do.
Yeah, I know you all. Yeah. But you lived there, so you get first dibs. Yeah.
But the officer told him, come to him anyway afterwards, and he said, "I didn't see anything to shoot at." He said, "Well, look at all them Yankees." He says, "I don't shoot people."
Yeah.
Short version.
Short version, yeah. And so other soldiers also followed his lead, and they had pledged not to kill. And the Christian Good story, who lived with his widow mother along molehill is the story that comes down to us. Some of the stories come down kind of as legends, maybe happened, maybe didn't, but that's one we've had pretty well a good documentation on it. So Stonewall Jackson and the Virginia military said, well, we can't get them to shoot. We'll give them other assignments. Some of them we'll send home to harvest the crops. And what happened? They started going home and not coming back. Going into hiding, trying to escape to the north, and so forth. One of the M's that is very big and important in Virginia is M for music. And I decided when I thought Stanley Good will be here, I'm not going to get into the music thing because he does it better than I do, and I don't understand all these things. It's just the shape notes go up and down, and that was a big part of the heritage. But these young fellows that were forced into the army would sit around the campfires and sing at night. And one of the songs that they sang was, "Am I a Soldier of the Cross?" And I suspect that their Baptist and Methodist co-soldiers understood those songs, but they didn't have the same meaning as they did for the Mennonite young men. Am I a soldier of the cross? And they were debating what we shall do. I mean, some went, some did not cooperate. Michael Shank, whose farm is right next to the Pike Church, he wouldn't go. And finally, the Confederate Army came with a wagon and loaded him up and took him to Winchester to jail. He wrote a long poem about suffering for the sake of Christ. If you have time sometime, look it up and read that poem. But they had many hours to wrestle with these things. So some of the young men voluntarily went into the army and lost their church membership if they were members. Generally, people didn't join church until after marriage in that era, so many of them had never really thought through all the implications. Others went into the military and then reconsidered. Philip Parrott, his father was a member at Cooks Creek Presbyterian Church. He grew up in Cooks Creek Presbyterian Church. His mother was a Mennonite. He was in the army. He deserted. He went back to the army. He deserted, came home, and came to the Mennonite community and said, I want to be baptized. And he made the break with the army and was baptized and then headed for Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Poor soul. Everybody up there spoke German. Only worldly people spoke English. And so they looked at this. They called him, he worked for a man named Lesher, so they called him Lesher's Rebel, and said, this guy, is he really a Mennonite? He can't speak German. And so there he was in Pennsylvania, homesick, English speaking, so forth. But he survived. He survived. Incidentally, eventually he was ordained to the ministry there, even though he couldn't speak German. Some people didn't really think he should be the preacher because he didn't know German. But he survived and was a blessing to the church there in Pennsylvania. That was, some went into the army. Some, like Philip, came back and said, no, I can't have anything to do with this. Others began to go into hiding, went north, and eventually both the Virginia government and the Confederate government gave exemptions to Mennonites and the larger non-resistant group, the Dunkers, the Brethren, and gave them exemption for those conscientiously opposed for war. And how did that happen? A large part was there were a group of 70 men left Weaver's Church, went across the mountains, escaping north. They got to Petersburg, and either 2 or 4, according to the record, Confederate scouts stopped them and arrested them, and rather than resisting them, they were, by a long process, they were marched from Petersburg down to Franklin, down to Monterey, across the mountains to Stanton. Only 2 of them escaped. They said, we're going to stick together so we can encourage one another. But anyhow, they got to Richmond. They were put in prison. They didn't know whether they were going to be shot. You don't just get arrested for deserting the Confederacy. And so, when their case came before the Confederate Congress, they produced their confession of faith, translated into English. It explained their beliefs, and one of the congressmen from the Deep South said, does anybody really live like these people say they do? And the government leaders from Rockingham County said, yes, we have people in our community who do live this way, that do not believe in warfare, and so they gave an exemption for those who were church members. For those who were not church members, they could pay a $500. Their fathers could pay for a substitute, but some people thought that was wrong. And everybody who was exempted had to pay $500 to the Confederate government, and the church gathered together and had no trouble gathering the money to pay for those who were church members. Those who were not church members, some of them had to go into the military, and some of them never came home. The war intensified. The spectrum of people who were of draft age went from 17 to 45. People who were afraid of losing their exemptions began to leave and go north. And so you have the Underground Railroad that developed in this community. It was for Mennonites and Brethren and disgruntled Confederates and a few blacks, and they would head over the mountains, heading for north for Ohio, Pennsylvania. And it was dangerous because there were roving groups of soldiers and bushwhackers moving through the mountains, and some of them didn't have a very good sense of direction. Some of them got lost. They were heading for Petersburg and ended up in Brock's Gap, and this kind of thing. And so it was just a very dangerous time. Meanwhile, at home, there were groups of soldiers who were looting, both Union and Confederate, coming in and stealing. The Confederate government had a 10% tax on farm crops. But when they came to Mennonite or Brethren homes, they tended to take, the government took more because they knew who they were. The women bore a big burden during this time. The men were gone. Eventually, they said church was made up of women, little children, and old men. The stories abound how women ingeniously hid their food, baked biscuits, and let their children carry them in their pockets to make sure that they had something to eat. One mother baked her bread and put it in the wood box, and then when the soldiers came, she sat on the wood box knitting, and they could smell the bread. If it smells like anything when my wife makes bread, but they couldn't find it, and she was sitting there busily knitting. Another lady baked her bread, put it in the cradle, put the baby in the cradle. The soldiers came, looked and couldn't find it. But that kind of thing went on and on and on. Then in 1864, General Grant said, I want the Shenandoah Valley destroyed, and 5 counties were systematically destroyed during the time of the burning. This community was outside the section where houses, barns, and everything was burned, but coming up through 613 over here was a group of soldiers burning, destroying everything that they could. And incidentally, the soldier that led the group up through here was a man by the name of Custer. And when he met his demise, this isn't nice to say, but when he met his demise at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the people of the valley just basically said, good riddance, and left it be at that. But he was responsible for burning this section. Anything that could be used by the Union Army was to be systematically destroyed. And so the people had a tremendous hard time after that. The Confederate Army gave them wagons so that they could go north as refugees, and many, about 400 wagon loads of refugees, Mennonites and Dunkers, went north and waited in the north until after the war to come back. It gave them a compassion for refugees. In the 1880s in the Gospel Herald, one of the Mennonite men wrote, "We suffered as refugees and we want to help the refugees who are coming." And that spirit of helping refugees has been with the Valley people ever since. And I cringe when I heard a Mennonite brother from my own congregation recently making comments about keeping all these immigrants out. We need to do that. And that's not part of our heritage. Our heritage is welcome those who have come as refugees. When the war ended, the time of sharing the gospel across the mountains opened up again. One of the men who pushed the ministers to go back into West Virginia to preach was Potter John. Some of you know the story of Potter John, who hid in the mountains and built little houses. And if you want to go to one of his houses, check with Dale and Doris. I think they have it. You still have it pinned on your phone? Okay. You better be in better shape than I am. What? Yeah. Okay. But anyhow, it's there's a stone chimney, and beside a spring, one of the places he hid. We don't know exactly, where he was when the stories about him are told. But one of the stories is that about him realizing that someone was coming to find him, and it had snowed, so he walked backwards up over the mountain into West Virginia. If it was where we were, it was hard enough to walk going straight forward without walking backwards. When the soldiers got to the cabin, they saw the tracks. And they thought they must not have been very good trackers, because they saw that the tracks were coming into his house, and one of them made the comment, maybe he ascended. Potter John took his Bible and his Mennonite Confession of Faith as he worked around Petersburg. He shared his faith as he worked in the orchards there, and after the war, he told the ministers, "We need to go back. These people are open to the gospel." And so you have records up through that period of time, ministers making 12-day trips, having 17 services, something like 685 people attended. And these preachers preached with fire and love and tears. And the gospel took root in those communities there. Then also during this time, the people began to establish places on this side of the mountain and the foothills, and churches were established a little bit later than 1900, where I basically stopped. But J.L. Heatwell talks about the number of mountain people baptized into the church. And he said the people in the mountain communities outnumbered the Mennonites in the valleys. For every 100 in the valley here in this area and to the west, he said there were about 73%, 73 people in the mountain churches for every 100 over here. In the northern district, it was like 2 to 1. There were more people in the mountain churches than there were in the valley churches. A tremendous ingathering of souls. And I think we might say, what has changed? I'm not going to speculate on what may have changed, but there was a passion for sharing the gospel. Passion for sharing the gospel. Oh, incidentally, as these refugees were going north, the young fellows, 17-year-old fellows that were going north as refugees, they would sit around the fires and sing. And I encourage us to keep that heritage of singing. It's a tremendous testimony, a tremendous encouragement. Between the Civil War and 1900, I come to the issue of movements. You may disagree with me. I think there are basically three renewal movements. The one renewal movement did not affect the valley very much because it was Mennonites who came from Russia during this time, left Russia because they were losing their privileges of non-resistance. And their influence was these people that came when they settled, they were interested in education and missions. These became the General Conference Mennonites and started missions among Native Americans. It's a fascinating story. Our Eastern people here in the East, people like Rudolf Petter, I had never heard of the man until our family was at where the Battle of Little Bighorn took place. And there was an old Native American man sitting there, and when we walked past, he said, "Are you all Mennonites?" Well, he didn't say you all, but "Are you Mennonites?" And then he said, "My grandfather," or "my father," I wish I would have written this down, said, "My grandfather helped Rudolf Petter translate the Bible into Cheyenne." And and I started looking up the whole story of the translation of the Bible into Cheyenne, hymns, books that came out of that movement, are probably still somewhat used by the Cheyenne people today. But that was a different group of people. But these people that really got into missions here in America early. And then another part, what often was called the Old Mennonites, became very, very active in all kinds of new things. Daniel Kaufman, who came later, used the term aggressive conservatives. Maybe that's an oxymoron. But they wanted to do things. They started publishing houses. They started old people's homes. They started institutions. They started city missions. And instead of in Virginia, they went into the mountains and preached to the people. But no, these aggressive Mennonites, they went to Chicago and started missions and other places. They really, and then along with that came developing of Sunday schools and protracted meetings. And protracted meetings simply means meetings that go on night after night. And during this time, there was a great awakening again in the Protestant churches, and these ideas were coming from the Protestant churches into the Mennonite churches. And Virginia was particularly strong in pushing for Sunday schools, usually held Sunday afternoons, and then they became what we called evergreen all year round. I have never been able to figure when they started attaching the Sunday school to the Sunday morning worship service. If anybody knows that, please let me know. But they would have separate Sunday schools. And as for protracted meetings, Virginia said you couldn't have them, but you could preach 2 nights in a meeting house and then go somewhere else and preach 2 nights. So guess what everybody did? They just followed the preacher around. They followed the preacher around and got around that one. And so they had their protracted meeting, and a large number of young people were gathered into the church. John S. Kaufman, who grew up in this community, had gone to Indiana, and he had a very quiet way about him, a very biblical way about him. He did not enter into the emotionalism of much of the revivalism of his era, but a large number of young people were gathered to Christ in the church during this time. I think at Weaver's Church one time there was a baptismal group of maybe 40. Is that right, David? Something like that. I have a paper that you compiled one time that has the list of all the names, and some of them are probably related to people here. I think Frank, maybe one of your grandmothers or something, I think she was converted there and then joined the old orders. Figure that one. Okay, but anyhow, but there was a passion for gathering the young people in. So there was the General Conference Mennonites interested in education, interested in missions, eventually going into foreign missions. There were the Old Mennonites who were very interested in institutions, getting busy, becoming active, serving. And for every action, there's an equal reaction, I think there's say. And also in this time, the Old Order movement arose and developed. And they might not like me to use this term, but it was kind of a revival movement, an Old Order revival movement. They reacted to all the activism. They wanted to emphasize community, mutual aid, group discipleship. And they felt that the people who were going out in all this mission work and things were just too individualistic. They wanted a group feeling. And the idea for all this passion for institutions and new ideas, they didn't think that was good. They wanted to hold to what became known as the Old Order. And so there was a revival kind of in Indiana, Ontario, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The only trouble with the Old Order revival in Virginia, it got a little bit nasty on both sides. And I will not go into names because there's too many people that are related, and I don't know who's related to whom. I'll just be very frank. I've lived in this community long enough not to talk about people because I never know who's related to whom. But if you want to know about that, L.J. Heatwell kept a record of it, which the Old Order people have read and said, yes, he was very honest about it. He kept a diary, Ranck's history book, 60 pages long about this division, if you can last through it. But basically, there were some strong leaders who bucked the bishop, L.J. Heatwell. He had moved to Missouri. He was ordained bishop. When he came back to Virginia, they accepted him as bishop here, but there was a large group of people that did not accept his leadership. They thought his ideas were too progressive, particularly when he preached an ordination sermon and not only preached about what you should do to be a minister, but what you shouldn't do. And the tobacco issue hit a tender spot here in Virginia. And the tobacco issue was a major issue here in Virginia. If you want to, you can go into EMC to the historical library and tell them you want to see the spittoon from Pike Church. Okay, that was part of the tobacco was very much accepted. At one time at conference at Weaver's Church, they said they made a plea: please do not spit tobacco juice on the church floor during services. So tobacco was an issue, and some people took offense to L.J. Heatwell, and the ordination was postponed, and then they finally had an ordination, and then the one who was ordained died, and some people said, that was the judgment of God. Kind of pig-headed things that were said. When when groups have splits, they often, after the issues are dead, they remember what people say. So be careful what you say, I'll just put it that way. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. It appears that both sides were kind of pig-headed on the issue. Some of them were very progressive in farming and developing the area around the Bank Church into good farms, but when it came to religious things, no, we'll keep the old ways of doing things. They had meetings after meetings. The history says that in one time when some ministers came in to hear about their problems, the people sat and sang 200 songs while they were waiting for people to share their concerns. I would have got worn out and gone home, I think. But the sad thing is that neither side had all the charity they needed. L.J. Heatwell didn't always listen to the other bishops, and people said nasty things. People also said things that really weren't true. One of the cases against the Sunday school that I found interesting was, he said, all the ungodly people and criminals of our age are boasting about being engaged in the Sunday school work. Come on. Don't overstate your case, put it that way. You want to build a case, and frankly, some of the things that were done with the Sunday school, I'm not sure I would have sent my children sometimes, but I would say this, that if you want to build your case, be humble and build your case. But don't go all these kind of things. God was at work in all this, Young people were coming into the church. God was blessing. But eventually, around 1900, those who were dissatisfied with the way things were going and wanted to keep to the old way of doing things, eventually they had a period of months, and they were told to decide, do you want to stay with the Virginia church or will you not? And so we have the rise of the Old Order Church. And after that, both groups moved forward. And I think we can say that both groups had their strengths and both groups had their weaknesses, and I trust that the blessing of God was on them in finding their place in the kingdom of God. I stop at 1900 because it was a changing time for the church. When you move into the next century, you have the beginning of the Eastern Mennonite School, which brought tremendous change to Virginia. You brought an emphasis on very specific church regulations, very specific statement of belief. But I'd like to end with perhaps just a story of one man who emphasized something that was good during this time. Gabriel D. Heatwell, he vacillated back and forth. He couldn't decide whether he wanted to be Virginia Conference or if he wanted to be Old Order. And so he decided to go with the Old Order Church. But Gabriel Heatwell had been going back over the mountains to West Virginia for years to preach. He would make up packets of shoots from apple trees, and he would go back and he would graft apples in the apple trees of people in West Virginia, and he would stay in their homes and he would preach. And he did that 20 years after he became an Old Order. The issue was not preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. The issue was, do we accept the latest innovation that comes along? And that's maybe a lasting thing for us to think about as Christians today. New ideas, new things come and go. Do we look at them carefully? The Virginia Mennonites rather slowly and deliberately accepted some of the new innovations, and obviously what we have today is a result of that. But there were others who felt like the old ways were better. The people in West Virginia loved Gabriel. During the day, he would graft apple trees, and in the evenings, he would preach in their homes, and particularly funerals. They would wait to have a funeral until the Mennonite preachers got there. And this is not particularly Gabriel, but one place, by the time the preachers got there, the widower had remarried. And he was so broken up at the funeral of his first wife that his second wife had to sit there and comfort him. But anyhow, I'm saying this, it was, the people were sensitive and wanted the gospel preached to them. And if we can reach out to our neighbors and bring them to the fact that they know that we love Jesus and that we love them. And Gabriel was a good example of one who kept right on doing his thing, sharing the gospel, and following Christ. Through the years, in that era, we struggled with all kinds of things. We struggled with, what about apple brandy? What about tobacco? How to keep your young people moving off and then disappearing. Greenbrier, West Virginia, whole settlement died out. They all went Methodist. Page County died out eventually. The question is, do we in our generation have a vibrant, living faith in Jesus Christ? We sang about this evening, a living, vibrant faith in Christ. So I want to challenge you with that. In our affiliations in the Anabaptist world, some try to glorify certain eras of our history. Some of the things that they did, what would we do if our young people went off to war in non-combatant service? What do you do when the Brotherhood is divided during the Civil War? The Augusta County people were very pro-Confederate. When the president called for a day of prayer and fasting, The ministry down there said, let's go for it. It was Jeff Davis. And the ones up here in Harrisonburg, they said, no, we're not going to have a day of prayer and fasting. And so these kind of issues, they change through the years, but they keep coming up again and again. And the question for us is, will we be faithful in our generation? My wife says sometimes I start stories and don't finish them, so is there any questions? Okay, God bless you in your faithfulness.